The gate was nothing more than 2 cedar posts and a length of rusted chain, but Deputy Marshal Marcus Zeller stood before it like it was the entrance to a cathedral, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt revolver. His jaw set so tight the muscles along his neck stood out like rope under canvas. The morning sun had barely crested the ridge of Powder Horn Mesa when the first rider came down the road, a broad-shouldered cattle hand from the Larson outfit, whose reputation for drinking and fighting arrived in town roughly 3 minutes before the man himself usually did. The rider pulled his horse to a slow walk as he approached, eyes sliding past Marcus to the modest white-painted house beyond the gate, smoke rising lazy and clean from its chimney, a calico curtain stirring at the window. "Morning, Deputy," the rider said, touching his hat brim in a gesture that was more habit than respect. "Morning," Marcus said. He did not move from the center of the road. "Keep riding." The cattle hand frowned. "I was just going to stop and ask the widow Harlow if she needed any." "This woman is spoken for," Marcus said. His voice was low, flat, and utterly without negotiation. The cattle hand stared at him for a full 5 seconds, during which nothing happened except a red-winged blackbird complained somewhere in the cottonwoods. Then the man spat to one side, nudged his horse with a heel, and rode on. Marcus did not watch him go. He watched the window. The calico curtain fell back into place. By noon, he had said it 4 more times. To a traveling salesman with a wagon full of patent medicines and a smile that worked harder than the rest of him. To a rancher's son who everyone in Cimarron County knew had been making intentions clear for the better part of 3 months. To a widower from 2 homesteads over who had the decent courtesy to look embarrassed when he turned his mule around. To a drifter who did not ask questions but studied Marcus with cold, dark eyes before deciding that whatever was on the other side of that gate was not worth the weight of that deputy's stare. And not one of those men knew the truth that was slowly killing Marcus Zeller from the inside out. Because the woman inside that house had not spoken a single word to him in 11 days. Not since the night she had found the letter he had written and never meant for anyone to read, the letter in which he had, with the clumsy honesty of a man who had never learned to say things out loud, written every last thing he felt about Serena Zane. And not one word of what he had written was a lie. That was the part that made it unbearable. Serena Zane had come to Cimarron County, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1882, which was the same year the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway finally stopped pretending it was not going to run a spur line through Hatchet Flats. The town of Hatchet Flats itself was the kind of place that existed because geography made it inevitable rather than because anyone had particularly wanted it. The Cimarron River bent hard just south of the mesa. The cattle trails crossed there. The railway needed a water tower, and before long there were 3 saloons, a general store, a land office, 2 competing churches that shared 1 minister on alternating Sundays, and a 2-room jailhouse that served as the official residence of the county's deputy marshal. Serena had arrived on the stage from Raton with 1 leather trunk, a rosewood box that she would not allow anyone to touch, and an expression that said she had not come all the way from Missouri to be asked a lot of questions. She was 26 years old, 5 feet and 4 inches of self-contained quiet, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned up with practical ferocity and brown eyes that had the quality of deep well water, which was to say, they looked calm on the surface and were cold and shockingly deep beneath. She had purchased the Collins homestead at the south end of town within a week of arriving, paying in cash money, and within a month, she had turned the neglected property into something that looked, improbably, like a home. The rosewood box, Marcus would later learn, contained her mother's violin. But that was much later. In the beginning, Marcus Zeller and Serena Zane existed in the same small town the way two adjacent fence posts exist, aware of each other by necessity, connected by function, not yet touching. Marcus was 31 at the time of her arrival, a lean and angular man with a face that had been weathered by 8 years of territorial law enforcement into something that was not quite handsome in the conventional sense, but was deeply, persistently interesting. He had gray eyes that cataloged everything they saw without apparent effort, brown hair that needed cutting approximately 3 weeks before he ever got around to cutting it, and the kind of stillness about him that men in dangerous occupations sometimes develop. The stillness of a hawk on a fence rail that is not sleeping and is not idle and is watching something 300 yards away that you cannot see. He had been appointed Deputy Marshal of Cimarron County by the United States Marshal's Office out of Santa Fe, and he had held the position for 6 years when Serena Zane arrived, long enough to have developed a thorough and unsentimental understanding of every person in Hatchet Flats and the surrounding territory. He knew who drank too much and on which nights. He knew whose cattle had a tendency to stray across property lines in the general direction of the neighbor's better pasture. He knew which of the Comanchero traders who passed through town were merely unpleasant and which ones warranted watching. He kept his own counsel, performed his duties without flair and without failure, and had, in the 8 years since leaving his family's farm in Kansas, constructed a life that was orderly, purposeful, and almost entirely empty of anything that could be hurt. He noticed Serena Zane the afternoon she arrived, the way he noticed everything, cataloging her in the efficient shorthand of a lawman's assessment. New arrival, woman, alone, well-dressed but not wealthy, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it. He touched his hat when she passed the jailhouse steps. She nodded. That was their entire relationship for approximately 2 weeks. The change, when it came from the direction of trouble, as changes in Hatchet Flats generally did. In the October of 1882, a man named Denton Cray rode into town. He came with 3 other men whose collective reputation had preceded them by way of a wanted circular from the marshal's office in Santa Fe, and the circular described Cray as dangerous, resourceful, and deeply committed to the business of taking things that did not belong to him. Land, specifically. Denton Cray had a scheme which was not a new scheme in the New Mexico Territory of 1882, for acquiring homestead claims from settlers who were either persuadable or intimidatable, or, in cases where neither of those approaches worked, simply absent. He had done it twice before in Colfax County, and once in Socorro County, and the reason he was still doing it was that the law in those places had been slower than he was. Marcus Zeller was not slower than him. But for the first 3 weeks, he also did not have enough evidence to move against Cray in any way that would stick in a territorial court. So he watched, and he cataloged, and he waited, and meanwhile Denton Cray began working his way through the southern homesteads like a man with a shopping list. Serena Zane was on that list. The first time Cray came to her gate, Marcus happened to be riding the South Road on his evening patrol. He pulled up at a distance and watched, his horse standing still under him, and he watched Serena Zane stand in her own doorway and listen to what Denton Cray was saying with an expression of such perfect, composed contempt that Marcus felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch. She looked at Denton Cray the way a woman looks at something distasteful that she is nonetheless fully prepared to deal with, and then she told him to get off her property. Cray rode away, Marcus should have continued his patrol. Instead, he sat on his horse for another full minute, watching the house, watching the door close, watching the lamp move behind the calico curtain as she went back to whatever she had been doing. Then he continued his patrol, but something had shifted in his internal inventory of hatchet flats. Serena Zane had moved from the category of new resident requiring standard observation to a category that he had not previously needed and did not have a professional name for, though it had, in the language of his own private life, only one name, and that name was important. He invented reasons to pass her property over the following days, not dishonest reasons exactly. The South Road was part of his patrol circuit. The Cimarron River crossing was at the end of it. These were true things. It was also true that before her arrival, he had varied his circuit and the South Road had appeared perhaps twice a week, and after her arrival it appeared every single day, sometimes twice. He began to know her schedule by the signs she left. The garden she was establishing along the east fence, which she worked in the early mornings. The lamp that came on at the same hour each evening, burning steadily until around 9 o'clock. The violin music that he heard once, late on a windless October night, drifting out across the cottonwoods and stopping him cold in the middle of the road with an emotion he could not precisely name, except that it felt like the musical equivalent of finally understanding something you had been trying to understand for a very long time. He began, against his own better judgment, to stop small things. Checking on the gate latch she had mentioned needed fixing, and fixing it without being asked. Leaving a report with her that one of Cray's men had been seen on the South Ridge, which was true and which she needed to know, but which he could have told her from horseback, and which he instead delivered at the door, and which led to an invitation for coffee that he accepted with a gravity that was entirely disproportionate to the occasion and entirely genuine. The coffee was very good. The kitchen was clean and organized with the precision of someone who had learned to depend entirely on themselves. The rosewood violin case sat on a shelf beside the window, and he looked at it once and then looked away because he understood, without being told, that some things were not for asking about yet. They talked about the county. They talked about the railway. They talked about the difficulties of establishing a garden in the alkaline soil along the Cimarron. They talked around everything that was actually happening between them with the mutual, careful courtesy of two people who are both fluent in the language of not quite saying things, and who are both, underneath that fluency, beginning to run out of patience with themselves. Cray came back a second time in November, and a third time in the first week of December. By the third visit, Marcus was close enough to have the technical legal basis for a formal warning, which he delivered in person, in the street, in front of witnesses, in the flat-voiced, gray-eyed, completely unhurried manner that had over the years proven more effective than raised voices or drawn weapons. He told Denton Cray that the next time he approached the Zane property without a lawful invitation, he would be escorted to the county jail pending investigation into his activities across 3 counties. And he told him this in a tone that made it clear it was not a threat, but a description of the immediate future. Cray went away. It was not a resolution. Marcus knew that. Men like Cray did not go away, they shifted their approach the way water shifts around a rock, finding the new angle, the new leverage. He had seen it before, and he would see it here. But Cray went away for now, and now was what he had to work with. What he had not anticipated was that his increasingly visible presence at and around Serena Zane's property would generate its own complications. Hatchet Flats was a small town in the deep sense, meaning that everyone who lived in it knew everything about everyone else with approximately 24 hours delay. and the sight of the county deputy marshal making daily stops at the Zane place had not gone unobserved or undiscussed. Serena herself observed it. She was not unaware of what it looked like, and she was not unaware, being a perceptive woman, of what it meant beyond the professional justification Marcus offered each time. She had her own private inventory of Marcus Zeller. She had catalogued his consistency, his restraint, his quiet competence that never announced itself but was always there. She had noticed the way he listened, which was with his full attention and no part of it reserved for formulating his own next sentence, which was rarer than people understood. She had noticed his hands, which were careful and precise in everything they did, and she had noticed the moment, some weeks in, when the careful professional distance he maintained during their conversations had developed a hairline fracture through which something entirely different was beginning to show, something that looked, when she caught it in an unguarded second, very much like longing. She had her own reasons for caution, her own dark past that she had not come to New Mexico territory to discuss. In Missouri, she had been, for 3 years, engaged to a man named Hartwell Briggs, a banker's son who had been charming and well-presented, and had turned out to possess a hidden motive behind every kindness he had ever extended, which was the acquisition of her family's property rather than the acquisition of herself. When his scheme had been discovered, the discovery had arrived too late to prevent the loss of the property, but in time to prevent the marriage, which Serena had ended with a precision that matched everything else she did. She had sold what remained, packed one trunk and a rosewood box and come west, where she intended to build something that belonged entirely to her and to owe its existence to no one else. She had not arrived in New Mexico territory looking for Marcus Zeller. She had not arrived looking for anyone. The fact that Marcus Zeller existed and was who he was represented a complication she had not planned for, and was not, in the first months of knowing him, sure she was willing to accept. The violin was part of the reason. She had not played it since leaving Missouri. The instrument had been her mother's, and her mother had been dead 4 years, and the music she had made on it was the kind of music that a woman makes when she is in the company of people she loves in a house she has lived in long enough to stop being careful about her own heart. Serena had stopped being willing to make that kind of music. The violin sat in its rosewood case on the shelf, and she did not open the case, and she told herself this was because she was busy, and the evenings were cold, and there were many practical things requiring her attention. The night Marcus heard her play, she had not known he was outside. She had opened the case because it was the anniversary of her mother's death, and she was alone, and, in the privacy of that aloneness, the grief she usually kept organized and controlled had simply arrived without warning, and the violin had been in her hands before she made a conscious decision. She had played for perhaps 20 minutes, sitting beside the lamp with her eyes closed, playing the pieces her mother had loved, the old ones, the ones that sounded like memory sounds like. Then she had put it away and gone to bed. She found out Marcus had been there when he mentioned it, carefully, obliquely, a week later. Not mentioning that he had stopped, not mentioning how long, just saying, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, that he had heard her play once, and that it was the most beautiful thing he had heard in a very long time. She had looked at him for a long moment. He had looked steadily back, the way he always did, not retreating from what he had said. She had said very quietly that her mother had taught her. He had said nothing after that. He had simply acknowledged it, the way he acknowledged things, with a small nod that somehow communicated that he understood the weight of what she had said, and was not going to do anything careless with it. She had thought about that nod for 3 days. December wore into January of 1883, and the town of Hatchet Flats had by this point fully absorbed and processed the situation between its deputy marshal and the widow from Missouri, collectively deciding, with the brisk pragmatism of frontier communities that could not afford the luxury of prolonged social suspense, that they were together in whatever sense two excessively careful people could be said to be together when neither of them had said so. Mabel Hutchins, who ran the general store with her husband Thomas, told anyone who would listen that she had never seen Marcus Zeller buy coffee for anyone except himself until this past November, and that was as good a declaration of intentions as any formal announcement in her view. Serena heard this from Mabel herself, said with a warmth that was genuine and a delight that was entirely unsubtle. She had gone home and sat in her kitchen for a long time, looking at the violin case, and then she had done something she had not done in months, which was to take out the small journal she kept and write in it. What she wrote was not something she would have said aloud, but it was honest, and it was this: that she was afraid not because she did not trust Marcus Zeller, but because she did, and trust was the thing that had hurt her before, and her heart was not a place she could afford to be careless with. What she did not know was that Marcus was engaged in exactly the same struggle, expressed in his own way. He had begun writing, not reports, not official correspondence. He kept a journal of sorts, though he would not have called it that, more of a series of written thoughts that he placed in the locked drawer of his desk at the jailhouse when they became too present to carry around in his head without distraction. He wrote about the county. He wrote about the legal situation with Cray, which was developing but not yet resolved. He wrote, with increasing frequency, about Serena Zane. He wrote about her courage, which was the quiet, undemonstrative kind that he considered the rarest and most genuine variety. He wrote about the way she moved through her days with a self-sufficiency that was not coldness, but rather a kind of integrity. He wrote about the violin. He wrote about what it felt like to talk to her, which he compared, somewhat awkwardly, to the experience of water on a very dry day, meaning necessary, meaning right, meaning something you had not known you were thirsty for until it was already in your hand. He wrote, eventually, that he was in love with her. He wrote it plainly, without the careful qualifications he usually applied to important statements, and then he read it back and knew it was true and locked it in the drawer and went about his day. He did not intend for her to find it. What happened was not planned by anyone. In the first week of February, Denton Cray made his anticipated return, not to Serena's gate this time but to the territory itself, with a refinement to his approach. He had been, in the intervening weeks, busy. He had found the dark past he needed, not Serena's as it turned out, but Marcus's. Cray had looked at it. He had someone who could look at such things. The complaint, taken out of context, read like a description of a deputy who had deliberately obstructed justice, which was not what had happened, but was what could be made to look like what had happened if you arranged the facts with sufficient malice and told them to the right people. Cray's play was elegant in the way that traps usually are. He let it be known, through careful channels, that he intended to file a formal complaint against Deputy Marshal Zeller with the United States Marshal's Office in Santa Fe, citing the 7-year-old incident as evidence of a pattern of conduct, and that this would result in Marcus's removal from his post pending investigation. He then sent a representative to Serena Zane's property with a revised offer for the land, at a price that was below market, but not insultingly so, with the implication, made carefully oblique but nonetheless clear, that when the deputy marshal was no longer in the county, the offer terms would become considerably less favorable. Serena refused, flat, immediate, without deliberation, but the representative had also left on her kitchen table a copy of the complaint document, She did not know what it was at first. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she sat very still in her kitchen for a very long time. That evening she went to the jailhouse. She found the drawer unlocked because Marcus had been careless that afternoon, distracted by the news that Cray's representative had been seen on the South Road. When she knocked and he was not there, which was unusual, she waited inside the way she had waited there before when he had invited her to wait. She was not looking through his things. She was sitting at the chair beside his desk, and the journal pages were visible where they had slid forward when the drawer had been pushed almost but not quite closed. And the top page was in his handwriting, and the first thing her eyes found, with the helpless, involuntary accuracy of the human heart finding what it most needs and most fears, was her own name. She read it, not all of it. Enough. She was gone when Marcus returned 20 minutes later. She had left the complaint document on his desk with a note that said only in her precise hand, "I think you should know he has this." He understood when he found the open drawer what had happened. He sat down at his desk for a long time. Then he picked up the complaint document and read it through and thought about what it meant and what Cray intended, which was clear, and what Serena had read in that drawer, which he could not know exactly but could estimate closely enough to make his chest feel very tight. He did not go to her that night. He sat with it the way he sat with most things, in the quiet of his own company, working it through. The Cray problem had a solution path that was technical and legal, and he could see it clearly enough. The other problem did not have a solution path he could see at all, which was a new experience for him and not a comfortable one. The 11 days that followed were the 11 days of silence. He went to her door on the first day after finding the open drawer. She answered it. She looked at him with an expression he could not read, which was also new, because in the months of knowing her he had become fluent in the quiet language of her face, and this was a word he did not know. He asked if she was all right. She said she was. He said there were things he needed to explain, about the document she had found, about Cray's intentions. She said she understood about the document, and that she had no intention of accommodating Cray's pressure. He said that was not what he needed to explain. There was a silence between them, then that lasted perhaps 15 seconds, and felt considerably longer. Then she said quietly that she needed some time to think, and she said it in a way that closed the door without closing the door, meaning she was not angry, or if she was, it was not at him, meaning she was dealing with something internal that she needed to deal with in her own way. He recognized this because he was someone who also dealt with things internally and in his own way, and he respected it. And he said all right, and he left. He gave her 10 days. He was on the 11th day when he made the decision that resulted in him standing at her gate at dawn. But between the first day and the 11th, the Cray situation reached its crisis point. Cray filed his complaint with the marshal's office on the 4th day. The notification arrived in Hatchet Flats by telegraph on the 5th day. It instructed Deputy Marshal Zeller to remain available for a review hearing in Santa Fe within 30 days. This was not a suspension, and it was not a dismissal, but it was the beginning of a process that Cray intended to use to remove Marcus from the county long enough to complete his land acquisitions, and everyone involved understood this, including the United States Marshal in Santa Fe, whose name was Gerald Finch and who had worked with Marcus for 6 years, and who sent a separate, unofficial telegraph message that said only, "I know what this is." Work fast. Marcus worked fast. He had been building the case against Cray for months with the patient, meticulous methodology that was his professional signature. He had land deed records showing the irregular acquisitions in Colfax and Socorro counties. He had 2 sworn affidavits from homesteaders in those counties, who had been intimidated into signing over their claims. He had a third affidavit from a surveyor in Raton who had been paid by Cray to falsify boundary measurements, and who had decided, after some reflection on the matter, that falsifying surveyors' measurements was not a career position he wished to maintain. He had, most recently, a statement from Cray's own representative, a man named Tolliver, who had made the mistake of trying to renegotiate his arrangement with Cray after the Zane visit, and who had discovered that Cray's approach to renegotiation involved threats that had sent Tolliver directly to the county jailhouse with a willingness to talk that was comprehensive and immediate. On the 8th day, Marcus rode to Santa Fe. He was back on the 10th day with a warrant from the federal court, co-signed by United States Marshal Gerald Finch, for the arrest of Denton Cray on charges of fraud, land theft, extortion, and filing a false and malicious official complaint against a federal officer. He arrested Cray the morning of the 10th day, before noon, in the street in front of the Cimarron Saloon, with 3 witnesses present, including Mabel Hutchins, who happened to be sweeping her front porch, and whose account of the event would be repeated with increasing narrative elaboration for years afterward. Cray was taken to the county jail and would subsequently be transported to Santa Fe to await a federal hearing. The charges against Marcus were formally withdrawn by Marshal Finch as part of the same legal action, with a notation in the file that the original complaint had been filed with malicious intent and no factual basis. It was done. The trap was dismantled. The hidden motive was exposed. The dark past that Cray had attempted to weaponize was returned to the sealed file where it had lived harmlessly for 7 years, and Marcus stood in the street outside his jailhouse on the afternoon of the 10th day and felt the satisfying click of a legal situation resolved, and then felt, immediately beneath that satisfaction, the entirely different and considerably more unresolved weight of what waited at the end of the South Road. He went back to his office. He sat down. He took out a fresh piece of paper and he started to write, not to Serena, but the way he had written before, to himself, working through what he needed to say and how he needed to say it. Then he put the paper down because he understood that this was not something that could be worked out on paper. He had already done all the writing he needed to do about Serena Zane. He had written everything he felt in that drawer, and she had read at least some of it. And now what was required was not more writing but the simple, terrifying act of saying it out loud. He went to bed instead, because it was late, and because he needed to think, and because standing at the end of a difficult situation looking at an equally difficult but entirely different kind of difficult situation was the kind of thing that benefited from the particular clarity that came only after sleeping. He woke at 4 in the morning with perfect clarity. He got dressed. He put on his coat. He took his hat. He walked out of the jailhouse and down the South Road in the February dark, with the stars enormous and cold above the mesa, and the Cimarron muttering to itself, somewhere to the east, and he arrived at Serena Zane's gate in the gray half-light that comes before dawn, and he stood there. He was not planning to stand there all day. He had not arrived with a strategy. He had arrived because the alternative, which was another day of not doing the thing that needed doing, was simply no longer something he was willing to choose. He was going to stand at this gate until she came out, and then he was going to say what he had written and locked away, out loud in his own voice, without the protection of paper and a locked drawer. What happened instead was that the first rider came by at 6 in the morning, and when that rider's eyes went past Marcus to the house with a look Marcus recognized as the preliminary to stopping and speaking to a woman who lived alone, something rose in Marcus's chest with a force and a clarity that bypassed all of his considerable capacity for restraint, and he said it without thinking, as naturally and inevitably as breathing. "This woman is spoken for." The words were out before he had examined them. They were absolutely true. He stood in the February cold and let the truth of them settle through him like the first heat from a wood stove on a cold morning. And then the cattle hand rode away, and Marcus stayed where he was because he had said it. And he meant it, and the only remaining question was whether Serena Zane was aware of this fact, and if she was, whether she was willing to accept it. It was the fourth rider, the rancher's son from 3 miles east whose name was young Patrick Hale and who had been making his interest in Serena extremely plain for months, that she appeared at her window for. Not to watch Patrick ride away, Marcus noted. She appeared when Marcus spoke. He could not see her expression from that distance, only the shape of her at the window, and then the curtain falling back. By midday, he had been standing at her gate for 6 hours. At 12:30, the door of the white-painted house opened and Serena Zane came out. She was wearing her blue wool coat and her hair was half down, which was unusual, which meant she had come out quickly without thinking too hard about it, and she was carrying 2 cups. She walked down the path from her door to the gate with the straight-backed, deliberate walk that he had come to know, and she stopped on her side of the chain link and held one of the cups out over the gate. He took it. Coffee. He wrapped both hands around it. She looked at him. He looked back. "Cray is in jail," he said. "I know," she said. "Mabel told me this morning. The complaint against me has been withdrawn." "I know that too." They were quiet for a moment. The coffee was very good. "How long have you been standing here?" she asked. "Since before sunrise." She looked at him. He could read her face again, and what he read in it was complicated, a mixture of things that included frustration and tenderness, and something that looked very much like the expression of a woman at the end of her patience with her own caution. "Marcus," she said. "I meant what I wrote," he said. "In the drawer, I need you to know I meant it. I know you read some of it." She was quiet. "I should have said it out loud before you found it that way," he said. "I'm better at writing things than saying them, which is a poor excuse, but it is the true one." "You have been saying it," she said. "Every day in every way except directly." "Yes," he said, "I know that." "And now you are standing at my gate in the February cold telling passing riders that I am spoken for," she said. And there was something in her voice that he paid close attention to, a careful evenness that was covering something else. "Yes," he said. "Are you asking me if I agree with that assessment?" "I think I am," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. And in that long moment, Marcus Zeller felt the kind of uncertainty that was unfamiliar to him, because it was not the uncertainty of a situation he could assess and manage, but the uncertainty of a human heart waiting to be received by another human heart, which was an entirely different kind of vulnerable, and one that no amount of professional competence could help you with. "My mother," Serena said, "used to say that the bravest thing she ever did was open her door to a man she did not yet know well enough to trust and invite him in for coffee anyway." Marcus did not say anything. "I have been thinking about the drawer for 11 days, she said. "I have been thinking about your name and mine on the same page. I have been thinking about whether I am ready to stop being afraid of what it means when someone matters." "Are you?" he said. She looked at him for another moment, and then she reached down and unlatched the gate. "Come inside," she said. "The coffee is better at the kitchen table." He walked through the gate. He was careful to close it behind him. What followed was not the dramatic declaration that novels prescribed or that the town of Hatchet Flats might have imagined. It was a conversation at a kitchen table that lasted almost 4 hours, during which they said all the things they had been carefully not saying for months. And some of the things that needed saying were hard, and some were frightening. And some were the kind of simple and honest that comes as a relief, after a long time of complication. She told him about Hartwell Briggs. She told it plainly, without self-pity, in the factual manner of someone reporting a thing that happened rather than a thing that was still happening. And he listened in the way that he listened, which was with full attention. And when she finished, he did not offer reassurance or commentary. He simply said that he understood now why her trust was a serious and carefully held thing, and that he was glad she had told him. He told her about the Kansas incident. The full version, not the document version. There had been a man named Joseph Crane, a Cheyenne man who had been falsely accused of theft by a merchant who wanted to avoid paying a legal debt. And the warrant Marcus had been given to serve was technically valid but factually corrupt. And he had known it, and had made his forced choice by letting Crane go and filing a report that technically described what happened, while omitting the parts that would have resulted in Crane's wrongful imprisonment. He had known at the time that it could cost him. He had done it anyway. He did not regret it, and he was not ashamed of it, but it had lived in him as a secret for 7 years, and having it weaponized by Cray had felt like a kind of violation that went deeper than professional threat. She listened to all of this. When he finished, she said that she did not think it sounded like obstruction of justice. She said it sounded like justice. They talked about smaller things after that. The garden, the railway, the alkaline soil and what grew in it despite everything. He told her about his family's farm in Kansas, which he had not talked about to anyone in a very long time. She told him about Missouri in the summers, the specific quality of summer evenings there, the fireflies which she missed. At some point she stood up to refill the coffee, and when she sat back down she was sitting closer to the table than before. And without deliberation or announcement, Marcus reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his. And that was how it began, the real beginning, quiet and certain and without performance. He stayed for dinner that evening. She cooked. He helped without being asked, working beside her in the small kitchen with a naturalness that surprised them both, the way some things slide into place as if they were made to fit there, and the only strange thing is that you waited so long to try. After dinner, he helped her wash the dishes. Then he sat in the chair by the window while she took the violin out of the rosewood case for the first time since the October night. And she played for a long time, and he sat and listened and did not speak. And it was, he would think afterward, one of the best evenings of his life. He walked home along the South Road in the February dark, and the stars were still enormous above the mesa, and he felt something in his chest that it took him the length of the road to identify, because he had not felt it for so long that he did not recognize it immediately. It was happiness. The uncomplicated, inhabitable kind. February became March, and the story of what was understood to have happened between the deputy marshal and the woman from Missouri settled into the texture of hatchet flats with the ease of things that seem, in retrospect, inevitable. Mabel Hutchins claimed complete credit for the development, on the grounds that she had predicted it from the day Serena arrived on the stage. Her husband Thomas said that was not quite true and was told calmly that it was absolutely true. Marcus and Serena were careful with each other in public, which was partly temperament and partly a respect for the rhythms of a small frontier town that had particular ideas about what was appropriate, and partly because both of them were, at their core, private people who did not feel the need to stage their feelings for an audience. What the town did not see was the kitchen table in the early evenings, and the conversations that had continued with the depth and the ease of two people discovering that the other person was capable of going to all the places in a conversation that you most wanted to go, which is rarer than people acknowledge, and which, when you find it, you hold on to. Spring came to Cimarron County, with the particular abruptness of New Mexico Territory springs, going from cold and brown to warm and vivid in the space of 2 weeks in March. Serena's garden established itself with stubborn success along the east fence, defying the alkaline soil by means she had researched carefully before coming west. The first green things appeared in the plot she had prepared, and Marcus stood at her fence one morning watching her work and felt the same sensation he always felt watching her do things, which was admiration of a specific kind, the kind that is not about surface, but about the quality of a person's engagement with their own life. She looked up and found him watching and did not hide that she was pleased. "Are you going to stand out there or come help?" she said. He came through the gate. They worked side by side in the garden for 2 hours that morning, which was not something either of them had planned. He had pulled a section of weeds and helped reinforce the east fence row before he thought to mention that he did have a patrol circuit to complete. She said the patrol could wait another 20 minutes. He agreed that it could. These were the ordinary days of something extraordinary, and they were both aware of that, both aware of the particular quality of happiness that is located not in the spectacular moments but in the accumulated small ones. The coffee, the garden, the evenings with the violin, the conversations that went everywhere and rested lightly on nothing. By April, he was having dinner at her table 4 nights a week. By May, Mabel Hutchins had asked, with the directness of a woman who felt that sufficient time had been allowed for natural development, when they were planning to make things official. Marcus had said with equal directness that he was working on it. Mabel had said that working on it was not the same as doing it. He had agreed that it was not. What he was actually doing was preparing something that was, for him, the equivalent of writing in the drawer, which was to say it was completely sincere, and took him considerably longer than it should have because he wanted to do it right, and he did not have a great deal of experience with doing this kind of thing right. He had bought a ring. He had bought it in Raton on a supply trip in early May, at a jeweler's on the main street, spending more time choosing it than the jeweler had expected him to spend, because Marcus Zeller chose things with attention, and this was not a thing he was choosing carelessly. It was a plain gold band with a small garnet set in it, the color of dark cherries, and when he held it in the jeweler's light, he thought of Serena's auburn hair and the way firelight moved in it, and he paid for the ring and put it in his coat pocket. He carried it for 3 weeks before he said anything, which was not indecision but preparation, working out in his quiet internal way how to say what he wanted to say and what he wanted the moment to be. He had decided it should be at her kitchen table because that was where they were most themselves, most honest, most at home. He had decided it should be in the evening. He had decided, somewhat against his own grain, that it should not be practiced because the things he said best were the things he said without practicing, when he was simply present in the room with her and speaking. The evening he chose was a Tuesday in the last week of May. They had had dinner, and she was at the window with the violin, playing quietly, and he was in the chair with his coffee going cold because he had forgotten about it. And when she finished the piece and looked up and found him watching her with the particular focused intensity that she had come to know meant, he was in the middle of something important he was not yet saying. She set the violin down on the table and gave him her full attention. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the ring and set it on the table between them. He said, "You told me once that your mother said the bravest thing she did was open her door to a man she did not yet know well enough to trust. I think the bravest thing I know how to do is ask you to trust me with the rest of your life, and tell you honestly that I intend to deserve it every day." Serena looked at the ring on the table. The garnet caught the lamplight and held it, warm and deep. Then she looked at him, and in her face was everything that she was, the strength and the caution and the hurt that had healed but left its shape. And beneath all of that, as present and real as the lamplight, something that had been growing since November and that she had been, until fairly recently, trying to be careful about, and she was done being careful about it. "Yes," she said. It was a single word and it was everything. He came around the table and she stood and he took her face in his careful, precise hands and he kissed her. And she kissed him back with the whole of herself, with no part of it held in reserve. And it was the first time since Missouri that she had not held any part of herself in reserve. And it felt, as the truly right things feel, like something coming home. They were married in June of 1883, in Hatchet Flats, in the smaller of the two churches, on a Saturday morning when the Cimarron country was in full early summer color. And the ceremony was attended by what appeared to be approximately 3/4 of the county's population, including Marshal Gerald Finch, who rode down from Santa Fe for the day, and who shook Marcus's hand with the warmth of a man who had watched someone he respected find their right life. Mabel Hutchins cried. Her husband Thomas told her she had no reason to cry at something she had personally orchestrated. She told him to be quiet. The minister, whose name was Reverend James Cole, and who had been performing weddings in this territory for 11 years, and had developed some understanding of the range of human feeling on display at them, said afterward that he had rarely seen two people stand before him with such a quality of absolute certainty, and that it had been, in his professional estimation, a very fine ceremony. The thing that Serena remembered most clearly afterward about the wedding day itself was not the ceremony or the gathering or the cake that Mabel had insisted on making, though these were all lovely in their ways. What she remembered was the moment Marcus took her hand after the vows and held it the way he held things he intended to keep, with full attention, and without performing the holding for anyone else's benefit, and the way that felt, which was like the resolution of something that had been unresolved for a very long time, not just since November, not just since Missouri, but before that, the deep settling of a person finding the place they are supposed to be. They moved her things into the jailhouse temporarily, while the Zane house was expanded to properly accommodate them both, a project that Marcus undertook with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, and that Serena contributed to with equal thoroughness, the two of them in considerable agreement about what they wanted, which was not elaborate or expensive, but was solid and warm and built to last. The new rooms were finished by September. The garden had extended along 2 fence lines by then. The violin played in the evenings. The lamp burned late. In the autumn of 1883, the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway completed its spur line through Hatchet Flats, which changed the town in the way railways always changed frontier towns, bringing goods and people and complications in roughly equal proportion. There was a land rush of modest dimensions as the railway access made the county more attractive, and this brought new residents, new disputes, new business for the marshal's office. Marcus handled it all with the steady, unhurried competence that was his professional hallmark. Serena, who had no intention of sitting idle, established a practical thing that she had been considering since her first months in Hatchet Flats, which was a school. The school was 2 rooms in a building adjacent to the larger church, established with the town council's approval in October of 1883. And it reflected Serena Zane Zeller's belief that the foundation of a functional community was its children's education, a belief she held as deeply and practically as she held everything else. She had 12 students by the end of the month and 19 by Christmas, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and she taught them reading and mathematics and geography and history with an energy and a rigor that most of them had not previously encountered in a teacher, and which most of them, after an initial period of adjustment, thoroughly responded to. Marcus would sometimes stop at the school window on his patrol circuit and watch her teach, which he did with the same quality of attention he had brought to everything about her from the beginning. And he thought regularly about the particular luck of a life in which the person you love most is also continually worth watching. Christmas of 1883 was quiet and very fine. He told her, that Christmas evening, that it was the best year of his life. She set the violin down and came to the chair and sat beside him and leaned against him and said that it was hers too. They sat like that for a long time while the fire burned low and the stars came out over Powder Horn Mesa, enormous and cold and brilliant in the New Mexico winter sky. In the spring of 1884, Serena told him she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, matter-of-factly, in the way she told him important things, which was directly and without preliminary, because she had found that directness was a kindness when the thing being said was something good. Marcus put his coffee cup down and looked at her. She looked back, and in her face was a happiness that was not the composed, private kind he was used to reading in her, but something more unguarded, something that had broken through the surface the way spring water breaks through ground, clear and entirely willing. He said her name, just her name. Then he got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hands and held them between his, and he could not find the words because, for once, the words were not the right instrument. And she understood that, and she laughed a little, the genuine laugh that was one of his most treasured things. And he held her hands and looked at her with everything he felt entirely visible on his face, because this was not a moment to be careful with himself. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. "That is the important thing." "Marcus," she said, "you may be happy about this." "I am," he said. "I am extremely happy about this." She smiled at him, wide and warm and entirely unguarded, and he kept holding her hands and thought about the February morning he had stood at her gate in the cold, and said the words that he had not quite understood the full weight of, when he said them, and how far they had traveled from that morning to this kitchen on this April Tuesday, and how the distance was made entirely of the right things. Their son was born in October of 1884, in Hatchet Flats, attended by the county doctor, a serious and capable man named Dr. Philip Wren, who had come to Hatchet Flats 2 years earlier, and who regarded childbirth as his particular professional province. Marcus was present, which was not universal practice but was also not, in a frontier community, without precedent, and he held Serena's hand through the labor with the complete focused presence he brought to everything that mattered to him. And when the baby arrived and Dr. Wren placed him in Serena's arms, and she looked down at him with an expression Marcus had never seen on her face before because she had not had occasion to make it before. An expression of absolute and unguarded love of the most fundamental kind. He felt something crack open in his chest that was not pain, but was the closest thing to it in the range of profound emotion. They named him Elias Thomas Zeller. The Thomas was for Thomas Hutchins, who was genuinely moved and whose wife Mabel was, predictably, not quiet about. Elias was a serious and attentive baby who grew into a serious and attentive child, which was not entirely surprising given his parentage, and who was by his first birthday clearly going to have his father's gray eyes and his mother's red-brown hair, which Serena said was an interesting combination, and Marcus said he thought would suit him very well. The school grew through 1885, adding a third room and a second teacher, a young woman from Taos named Ellen Briggs, who Serena had interviewed carefully and approved on the grounds of her competence, and her genuine interest in the students rather than her credentials, which were not inconsiderable, but were secondary to the question of character. Ellen turned out to be excellent at her work, and became, over time, a genuine friend, the first close female friendship Serena had permitted herself since Missouri, which Marcus noted with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching someone he loves expand their trust in the world. In the summer of 1885, Marcus was offered a promotion to full United States Marshal for the district, replacing Gerald Finch, who was retiring to his family in Santa Fe. The offer came from the marshal's office with a formal letter and the weight of a significant career advancement, and it came with a relocation requirement, as the district office was in Santa Fe. He and Serena talked about it at the kitchen table for 3 evenings. He was honest about what he wanted. He wanted the work, which was important and which he was capable of doing well. He wanted it for the right reasons. The expansion of jurisdiction that would let him address the kinds of systemic land injustices he had seen in Colfax and Socorro counties, the larger platform for the work he believed in. He also wanted to know what she thought, not as a courtesy but because they had built something in Hatchet Flats that was genuinely theirs. The house, the garden, the school, the connections of a real community, and dismantling that was not a small thing. Serena listened to all of this, and then she said that she thought he should take it, and she said it with a certainty that he knew was genuine, because she was not a person who said things for the other person's comfort when she believed something different. She said, "We built this here because it was where we were. We will build the next place because it is where we go. The things that matter between us are not the house or the garden. Those things we can make anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. "The school," he said. "Ellen is excellent," she said, "and there are children in Santa Fe who need schools too." "You have thought about this already," he said. "I have thought about it since the day you said you were working on it," she said. "I told you I know you." He had smiled then, the full, uncalculated smile that she had worked hard in the early days to earn, and that she now considered one of her most significant achievements, and he had reached across the kitchen table and taken her hand. They packed for Santa Fe in September of 1885, and the leaving of Hatchet Flats was attended by most of the town, which had strong feelings about the departure of its deputy marshal and the schoolteacher who had educated a significant portion of its children. Mabel Hutchins gave a speech, which no one had asked her to give but which everyone listened to because Mabel Hutchins giving a speech was not a thing that could be redirected. The speech was primarily about how she had known from the beginning. She was not wrong. Marcus took office as United States Marshal of the New Mexico District in October of 1885. He was, by every account, a remarkable marshal. Santa Fe suited Serena in ways that surprised her. She had expected to miss Hatchet Flats more completely than she did, and she did miss it. The Cimarron River and the mesa and the garden along the east fence, and the particular quality of evening light in that valley. But Santa Fe was older and more layered than Hatchet Flats, a genuine city by territorial standards, with a history that went back centuries, and a cultural complexity that she found genuinely interesting after the compressed simplicity of Hatchet Flats. She established a school within 3 months of arriving, this one slightly larger in ambition, and connected to the existing educational efforts in the city, working with the Sisters of Loretto, who had been operating schools in the territory since the 1850s, and who received Serena with a professional respect that was mutual. The school she developed was non-sectarian and open to all children in the district regardless of background, which was something the sisters supported, and which reflected a principle Serena held without compromise. Elias, who was 1 year old when they arrived in Santa Fe, grew up in a house on the north side of the city near the Acequia Mater, with a garden that Serena established in the first spring. smaller than the Hatchet Flats garden but in soil that was, if anything, more stubborn, and which she consequently worked with the particular determination she applied to difficult things. The violin played in the evenings. Marcus came home at the end of his working days to his kitchen, and his wife and his son and the sound of music in the lamplight. And he sat in the chair that was, by now, simply his chair in every house they inhabited. And he held his coffee and watched his family and thought, regularly, about the February morning at the gate. He thought about the words he had said. He thought about how they had been true before he understood their full weight, the way some true things are. This woman is spoken for. He had said it to protect her, which was instinct. He had said it because he could not imagine another man at her door without something rising in him that he did not have a name for yet. And he had said it, he understood now, because it was the truest description of himself that he had ever offered in public, which was not about possession. The word spoken for was not about that. It was about commitment, about the direction of your whole self toward one person in a way that was not a cage but a compass, that told you where you were, that told you which way was home. In 1887, their second child arrived. A daughter this time, born in April in the Santa Fe house, attended again by a doctor and by Mabel Hutchins, who had made the trip from Hatchet Flats in what she described as a professional capacity, and which was actually because nothing in the world would have kept her away. The girl was born in the early morning before sunrise, when the sky above the Sangre de Cristo Mountains was the specific dark blue that precedes dawn, and she arrived announcing herself with a volume that suggested she had opinions about the world and intended to express them. They named her Clara Marie Zeller. The Marie was for Serena's mother. Clara had her mother's brown eyes and her father's quiet intensity, and they would discover by her second birthday her grandmother's affinity for music, which she communicated by sitting on the floor beside the violin case and staring at it with the focused absorption of someone who understood that something important lived inside that box. Elias, who was 3 and very serious about his position as an older brother, appointed himself Clara's primary guardian with an earnestness that was both genuine and somewhat exhausting, and which his parents found entirely endearing. Serena was 31 in 1887. She taught school 4 days a week and ran her household on principles of order and warmth, which she had found were not in conflict, and she played the violin in the evenings, not always the sad pieces now, sometimes the quick, bright ones, sometimes new ones that she was learning, because she had found in Santa Fe a woman who gave lessons and whose name was Mrs. Adaline Torres, and who was the finest musician Serena had encountered outside of her mother, and who had introduced her to music she had never played before. She wrote letters to Ellen in Hatchet Flats. She corresponded with her father's sister in Missouri, the only family she had maintained contact with after the Briggs situation, a straightforward and warm woman named Aunt Ruth, who had been the first person Serena had trusted with the news of her engagement to Marcus, and who had written back, "I knew it would be someone like that. You always needed someone who understood the quiet." Marcus was 36 in 1887. He was regarded in territorial legal circles as exceptionally capable, and in personal terms as a man of considerable integrity and limited social display, which suited the role of U.S. Marshal well, because people tended not to underestimate a marshal who did not perform his authority, and tended very much to regret it when they did. He had handled 2 significant fraud cases, and 1 complicated matter involving disputed treaty land rights that had required careful legal navigation, and a willingness to insist on the correct legal interpretation against considerable political pressure, which he had done without apparent difficulty, and without making enemies, he did not consider worth making. He was, by his own private accounting, exactly where he was supposed to be. Not in the geographical sense, though Santa Fe was fine, and the Sangre de Cristos were beautiful in ways that the Kansas plains had not prepared him for. In the larger sense. The sense in which a life can be in the right place. The evenings were the best part. They had always been the best part, since the first evenings in Hatchet Flats, the kitchen table and the coffee and the conversation that went everywhere. Now there was more to it. There were the children's bedtimes, which required the specific parental arts of story and patience, and which Marcus had discovered he was considerably better at than he would have predicted, sitting on the edge of Elias's bed and telling him stories that were almost entirely improvised, and that Elias received with the solemn attention of a critic at the theater. There was Clara's habit of refusing to sleep until someone held her, which was Serena's province primarily, but which Marcus was also not above performing while walking in slow circles in the lamplight. The small, warm weight of his daughter against his chest, her dark eyes blinking up at him in the half-dark. And then the children were asleep, and it was the two of them, as it had been from the beginning, the kitchen table and the coffee and the quiet, and sometimes the violin, and sometimes just the sitting together in the comfortable silence of two people who have talked everything through and know that the silence between them is full rather than empty. One evening in the late autumn of 1887, Serena was playing something new, a piece she had been learning from Adaline Torres, long and complex, and full of something that felt, listening to it, like nostalgia for a place you had never been. Marcus sat in his chair and listened, and when she finished and set the bow down, she looked at him. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He considered the question in the way he considered things, fully, without hurry. "The gate," he said. She tilted her head. She knew which gate. "The cedar posts," he said. "The February morning. I was thinking about standing there and what I said to that first rider without thinking it through. I was thinking about how the truest things are usually the ones that come out before you have time to be careful about them." She was quiet for a moment. "What I read in the drawer," she said, "in those pages. I have read a lot of words in my life, and I have never read anything that made me feel so completely seen." He looked at her. "That is why I was afraid," she said. "Not because of what you had written. Because of what it meant that you had seen me that clearly and I had let you without realizing it." "And now," he said. She set the violin down carefully on the table beside her. Then she came across the room to his chair and sat beside him, her shoulder against his, the way she had sat beside him on a Christmas evening 4 years ago in Hatchet Flats while the fire burned low. "Now I am glad," she said. "Being seen is the right word for what you do. You see me. All of it, the careful parts and the frightened parts and the parts I am proud of, and you stay. Every morning you are still the same man." He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and for a while neither of them said anything, which was not silence but the fullness of everything that was between them, solid and warm and built to last. But right now it was the evening, and the lamp was burning, and the violin was on the table, and Marcus Zeller sat with the woman he had stood in the February cold to claim, and she sat with the man who had said the truest thing he had ever said before he understood its weight, and there was nothing between them that was hidden any more. No locked drawers and no careful distances and no dark pasts that had not been spoken and understood. Which would include a letter from Hatchet Flats in 1891 from Ellen, saying that the school had expanded again and was now the finest in Cimarron County, and that she wanted Serena to know that she credited this to the foundation Serena had built, and that there was a garden plot beside the school that the students had planted, and that they called it, without any directive from Ellen, the Zeller Garden. They walked to the house, which was being kept by a family from Colorado who had bought it when Marcus and Serena moved to Santa Fe. The new family was friendly and permitted them to walk around the garden, which was now someone else's garden but which still had, along the east fence, the original planting line that Serena had laid down a decade ago. She stood at the east fence and ran her hand along the top rail and said nothing. Marcus stood beside her. His hand found hers. Then Elias, who had walked ahead to the south gate, the cedar post gate with the length of chain, said, "Papa, is this the gate you told us about?" Marcus looked at it from the end of the path. The cedar had weathered another decade of New Mexico sun, and it was silver-gray now, the chain a little more rust-colored than before. But it was the same gate. "Yes," he said. Elias looked at it with the gravity of a child assessing a historical site. "And you just stood here." "I stood here," Marcus said, "all day, most of the morning." Elias considered this. "And you told everyone who rode by that mama was spoken for." "I did." Elias looked at the gate and then at his father and then at his mother, in the systematic way he had of gathering information before forming a conclusion. Then he said, in his serious 8-year-old's voice, "That seems like a reasonable thing to do." Clara said, with the authority of a 5-year-old, "It is very romantic." Samuel said nothing because he was asleep. Marcus looked at Serena. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back.